Hi there, and thanks so much for joining me for another video. I'm Erin Eno, and today we're going to be painting this vibrant purple pansy. It's more of a realistic pansy, and if you're thinking that you can't do this, if you're a beginner watercolorist, you can do this. I'm going to show you how to draw it, and then we're going to go through how to paint it step by step. So just take your time and you will be able to paint this. If you do like this video, please be sure to like and share, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's jump in and get started. So before we start, I'll just do a run through of the materials I'm using. I have my Baohong Academy cold pressed watercolor paper. It's 140 pound, 100% cotton. My sheet size is 8 by 10, I believe. I have my Royal Talons Van Gogh paints in my palette, jar of water and a paper towel, and I have 3 brushes on hand. I have 2 Curry's store brand brushes in their 2500 series, one in a size 10 and one in a size 2, and I have a size 6 round in their 2400 series. So as you can see, I've already got my sketch on my paper. That's because the first time I did it, it came out kind of wonky, and I wanted to make sure it was right. So I'm actually just going to go over this on my iPad so you can see how I drew it out. Okay, so I've got my sketch up on my iPad along with a picture of the pansy that we're going to be following for color. I may do it like just a little deeper purple around the edges of some of the petals. But anyway, so the picture is not the ideal pansy because I'm not too big on the 2 back petals, but we're going to just use it as a guideline for color so that'll make sense when I'm drawing it and going over it with you. So first of all, it's got 2 kind of it has 2 stamens in the middle like this, okay? And actually I'm just gonna fix that. That wasn't very smooth. I'm not the best at drawing on my iPad. I find it a little awkward sometimes. So now we're just gonna go through and do each petal. So every pansy has 5 petals, one being at the very front like this, and sometimes they actually look like 2 petals kind of growing together because they get a little bit of a dip in this area here, but it's actually just 1 petal, okay, even if it looks like 2. So we'll get rid of that. Then behind that there are 2 more petals like so, and they can be kind of a little wavy. They don't have to be perfectly smooth like that. And then now I'm going to indicate just where some of the color go. Actually, you know what? Let's just do all the petals first. Then behind these 2 petals are 2 more petals. And they're kind of roundish. Some of them have some waves to them, so it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to actually make this one a little wavier than my sketch. So I'm just going to put a little bit of a dip in there. And that's it. So that is why I didn't like the picture on the left, because the 2 back petals were covering each other too much. So this is why I'm going with this one here. So we're just kind of using that picture as a guideline. Now for color, coming out from where those 2 stamens are on this first main petal, there's just a little hit of really bright yellow. Now I'm making that a little bigger than it is because the next band of color, or next patch of color, is purple, and we can paint over that yellow with the purple because this purple is going to be really dark, okay? So I'm just going to make this a little smaller than it actually is, and then when we paint it we can go beyond that guideline. So it's going to come and dip in and then come back out like so. And then on the 2 petals that are behind that, you have that same hit of a dark purple, okay? And the shapes are, you know, they can be just kind of rough. And that's it for the pansy petals. It's pretty simple. So now we're going to do some leaves, and the leaves are kind of like, they're kind of serrated on the edges, but they're rounded, almost like a rounded or smoothed out rose petal kind of. So I'm going to do, I think, just 4 leaves like I have on my sketch here. And they're pretty simple. It's just that they kind of dip in, maybe almost like an oak leaf, but not quite so drastic. I don't like the shape of that. Let me just fix that up. I just want it a little rounder than that. There we go. And then I will do one down here. Same thing, these round little dips that come in. Like that. And then we're going to do two coming off this bottom right hand side. I'm going slow because drawing on an iPad is not like drawing on a piece of paper, and it can get pretty slippery. I don't draw on my iPad a lot, so I don't have a lot of practice on it. But there you go, and there's your 4 leaves, and they're just pretty simple and basic, and we'll put some details in when we paint. But that's your simple pansy. So you can take a screen capture of that, do your drawing, and then we'll get on to painting. So I need a plan of attack with this because we're using purple and yellow, and they are complementary colors, and if we mix those together we will get brown, so we do not want that. So I think what I'm going to do is first start with that pale yellow, get that down, let it dry, and then we can paint on top of it without worrying about things running into each other and getting all muddy. So I'm going to use permanent lemon yellow, and it's a pretty clean yellow, and the yellow in the pansy, even though it doesn't look like it, can be a little on the greenish side. So I'm just going to take like the slightest amount of sap green and just add it to it so it's not like screaming yellow. I'm going to get that little speck of whatever it is out of my palette. And I think I'll add some Azo Yellow Medium to warm it up a bit. Okay, so I think that should do. We don't need a lot of it because we're just going to be doing a really light wash. So I'm just going to get some of that pigment off my brush, and I'm going to start with this petal here. Now we don't have to worry about the stamens or anything because they're actually pretty much the same color. So I'm just going to put, like I say, a light wash, and we can come into that pencil line where that purple is because the purple is going to cover the yellow. I'm going to pick some of it up here because that's just a bit much. We'll go back to that guy. So that's all I want to do for that. Then I'm going to rinse my brush off, get most of that pigment off, and just fade it out to almost nothing, pretty much nothing. And that's going to dry lighter as well. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing to this petal. And because this has a purple ridge or purple edge to it, I can go in and do the yellow here, and I'm just not going to take it out right to the edge so it won't bleed into each other. And while that's drying, I think I'm going to move up to the 2 petals in the background. We can only do one at a time because they do touch, and there's no yellow in them. So I'm just going to use permanent blue violet only because I don't want to fuss with mixing a lot of different colors. It's not the same as the color in the picture, but I actually prefer this kind of purple. I'm going to wet the whole petal first. So just clean water. And you're going to come to the edge of this petal. Okay, so I'm just wetting that entire petal. and I'm going to switch to my number 6 brush because I want a little more control as to how much purple I put down there, because we're going to bleed this all into that petal. So we're going to go quite vibrant just around the outside edge. Okay, so I'm just going to tap it all in. I can even be a little deeper than that. Like so. Okay, and this is just going to go where we have the water. And then I'm just going to bring it in some spots. Just tap it in. And let it bleed. But what I'm going to do also is just put a little bit of a wash of the purple all the way down till it hits that front petal. Okay, just so we don't have pure white on that petal. Then I'm going to take my number 2 brush, and I just want it a little damp. I don't want it wet. And I'm just going to start to drag some of that purple down into this petal so you get these lines. And you don't want your brush very wet. If you have to go back in and get more paint to put around the edge, that works too. You may have to do that. I have to do it, as I see. I don't quite have enough pigment on my petal. Oh, I almost screwed that up. I don't want that. Let me just fix that edge. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to clean off my brush and then go back in. My brush is almost dry, and I'm just dragging in these lines of pigment. Just like that. Now that petal is really wet, so we can't go in and do that petal yet, or it will be a mess. The yellow is still damp as well. I think what we'll do is go on and do some of the leaves. And I'm just going to use my number 6 for the leaves. And I'm going to use sap green with some cobalt blue, just so it's not too bright and yellow a green. Get some cobalt blue in there. It's a nice deep green. And I'm just going to, we can only do one leaf at a time too because they touch. This is where patience comes into play. I'm going to have a little bit of a darker edge there just so it can define the edge of the leaf beside it. Okay, so I'm just going to dip my brush in my water and start dragging this paint out. Could probably stand to have a little bit more. Just to give it a little bit of a shadow there. We can always go in and add some detail later if we feel that they're a little on the weak side. So now I'll do this petal over here, or this leaf over here, and the shadow will be on this leaf. So this one we don't need to worry about putting too much of a shadow on it. You can, of course, put some darker areas just to give it some shape, which is always nice. You don't want a dead flat leaf. There we go. And then I think what I'll do is I'll take my number 2 brush and see if I can pull out some kind of veining on this guy. And it might be too late, it might be too dry. This brush might be too big. Yeah, I think what I'll do is go in and do dark veining instead. It's a little easier. So I don't have a whole lot of water on my brush because I don't want it to bleed too much. But I just want some kind of indication of some veining. I may go tap a little bit more pigment in here to kind of accentuate that shadow a bit. This line went a little thick. I'm not big on that, so I'm just going to pick some of that up. There we go. Oh, this leaf seems to be a little darker than that one, so I'm just going to try to pick a little bit of that pigment up. And then go back in with some darker pigment to try to get some veining in on this guy too. I may have to add a little black to it to get it a little deeper. Maybe I will add some, well, just a teensy little bit of black, just to make it a little bit deeper. And it may be too wet. But that's okay. Still going to give it a bit of shape. I'm just going to blend this out because I'm getting a weird kind of hard edge there and there. Okay, so I've just mixed up a little bit of a stronger pigment of this green, and I'm just going to go in and just put a few little veins in here. Deepen this one up now too. I don't want to spend all day on the leaves. Just going to soften this part up a little bit. I'm just kind of doing trial and error here as I go, so I'm kind of learning what's working and what's not, so bear with me. Just picking up a little bit of pigment here just to bring out that vein a little bit. Okay, just gives it a little bit of shape. It's certainly not 100% realistic, like I say. Okay, so I think this is dry enough now that we can go in and just touch up the little stamens. I'm just going to still use my number 2 brush. Okay, and I'm going to make these just a little bit brighter. I know they're not in the photo, but I just kind of want to do that. Then I'm going to add this little patch of really bright yellow there, and it's almost like pure azo yellow medium, maybe with a little bit of orange to it, a little bit of an orangey tone. So I'm going to go in and add a little bit of my permanent red light, which is pretty orange. Maybe not that orange. That looks good. And I'm going to paint this little section here. It may bleed into those stamens, but I wouldn't cry over it. And remember, we're going to paint this bigger than it really is because we're going to paint the really dark purple over top of that. Okay, so that's that. We could even tap in a little bit of green there because it looks like there's a little bit of green coming out of the center. Just like that. Just ever so slightly. And that purple petal, because there wasn't a lot of water in that paint that we put on the edge, we can go in and paint that now. I think it's dry enough. So I'm going to take my number 6 brush. I'm actually going to turn my paper so it's easier to get into that small area. And remember, we're going right up to that petal in the foreground. We're going right up to this leaf, which I hope is dry enough. And right up to the purple petal that we had already painted. So now that the entire petal is wet, I'm just going in with that really strong value of that purple, tapping it in around the edges like we did on the first purple petal, and I'm just tapping in a little bit more to make sure that I have enough to drag down into the rest of the petal. And just make this not like so uniform so it's just around the edge. That's why I'm just bringing in the purple a little further in some areas. And then here I'm doing the same thing that we did in the first petal, which was just put a light wash of that purple there so that the rest of the petal isn't just pure white. I'm picking up a little pigment here because I think it was just a little bit heavy. And then I'm going to go in with just my slightly damp, almost dry number 2 brush, and again dragging those lines in. And just make sure when you do this that you're kind of following the curve of the petal. Okay, so you don't want to just do like straight lines. And that's about all there is to it. So now while those dry, I think we're safe to go in and do these other leaves now. Okay, and I want this one a little bit lighter so it has contrast to that other edge of the other leaf. I hope I'm making this clear for you, because sometimes what's in my head doesn't come out the right way for you to understand it, but I hope I'm making sense. So I'm going to put a little bit of extra pigment just below the petal to act as a bit of a shadow. And I'm just going to rinse my brush, or just dip my brush in my water and drag it on the edge of my jar once, just to get some of that pigment off. And then we just fill in the rest of the leaf. I'm just going to take some of the water off my brush, go back into that green, and make it even a little bit darker. Just like that. And I'm going to take my number 2 brush. It's not very wet at all. I've hardly got any water on it. Basically no water. I've just tapped it into the paint. Okay, just to try to get some veining on this guy as well. It doesn't have to be drastic. We can even go back in with even darker pigment and accentuate the shadows a little more if we want. but I'm running out of the green here. I'm just going to mix a little more green up. And we're going to come and do our last leaf. And I'm just going to tap in a little extra pigment here for some shadow. And I think on this guy too. And I can go in at this point because this one's dry. Just tap a little extra shadow there. So I'm just going to rinse and dry off my, rinse and dry off my brush and just blend this out a little bit. So now I'm going to go in and do the really dark purple that's coming out of the center, and it's really dark. It's so dark it's almost black, and I don't want to get carried away with it. So I am going to mix some extra purple over here because I still need some clean purple for the outer edge of these petals, but I want to add some black to this purple because it is like so dark. And I want to make sure it's good and dark. And I'm going to use like really rich pigment, not a lot of water, just so it behaves. Okay, and I'm going to paint up to that stamen thing and up to that leaf or that other front petal. And this shape is kind of natural. It doesn't have to be anything too contrived. And I'm just gonna take my brush, I'm gonna clean it off. Actually, you know what? I can bring it out a little more. Just a little bit more. Then I'm going to clean and dry off my brush. And I'm just going to drag that paint out into these little wispy lines. Again, you're going to follow the shape, the curve of the petal. Okay, just like that. Okay, and because it's straight pigment, you should be able to control this. It's almost, well, it's not almost, it's basically dry brushing. There's no water on my brush. Okay, just like that. Okay, and remember when I said that I made this bigger because we can go over it with the dark purple? That's what we're going to do now. So again, we're going to just do these kind of rough, ragged, spiky lines into that yellow. Okay, it's still almost that dry brush. Just like that, okay? Then I'm going to take it and carry the purple out. It's actually almost too dry. I'm going to put a little bit more black in there. So I want to go follow the shape that we drew, but we don't have to go right out to the edge because we're going to drag it out. So this isn't too difficult. It's just time consuming because we have to wait for each petal to dry. So we're going back and forth. It gets a little confusing. So now that I've got to drag those lines out, I'm going to turn my paper and start dragging those wispy lines out. And if it's too dry, go back in and put a little extra paint down. Like mine is too dry. Now we have one more to do. And that is this guy on this side. So we're going around the stamen. Leave that edge of that petal in the foreground, okay? Don't go right into the edge of it. Now I'm not even looking at my reference photo at this point because it really doesn't matter. I'm just dragging these lines out. Nature isn't perfect and every pansy is a little different. The coloring will be a little different. I'm going to add a little more to this guy. And that's that. Now what I want to do is I'm going to take my I'm going to use my number 6 and my number 2, and we're going to do the outer edge of these last 3 petals. We may have to wait for one to dry before we start the other one, but I think I will start with this outer edge one just so I can be sure that what I'm going to do here is going to work. And I'm going to take this purple. This is the purple without the black in it. And I'm just going to use a little bit of a wash this time. I don't want to start off too dark, and I'm going to go around the outer edge. I can go a little darker than that. That's better. Okay, so we're going all around the outer edge of that petal. And the only reason I made it a little darker is because I want it to have a little definition between this and the petal behind it. Then I'm going to rinse my brush off. I'm just going to soften this up so it kind of blends out. We can go in and add a little bit more pigment on it if we want. I think I will, just a little bit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to still stick with my number 6, but I've cleaned it off. It's just damp now, and I'm just going to start dragging this paint in to that petal. And again, you have to follow the shape of the petal. Follow that curve. You can go in and deepen it up even further. I just didn't want to start off too dark because, you know, with watercolor you can always add, but it's a lot harder to take away. Okay, so again with the clean damp brush, just bring this into the yellow. So if we had done this without letting that yellow dry, it would have all kind of blended, the purple and the yellow, and it would have been kind of, well, would have been mud color. I still want the outer edge to just be a little bit more purple than it is. And because that's wet, it's going to bleed in. And I'm just going to let it bleed in on its own. I don't really want to push that in because that's going to continue to bleed. Okay. But I just wanted it a little deeper so it had a little more contrast from the yellow. Okay, so to avoid a horrendously long video, I'm just going to speed up the last 2 petals, and I'm just duplicating the process I did for the first petal. So you're just going to put some purple all around the outer edge of that one petal. And I'm just darkening up again just to kind of match what we did on the first petal. Going to rinse and dry off my brush and just drag in those lines again, being careful to follow the shape of the petal as we did before, following the curve of the petal. And do this in increments like I did here. It's better to go in and add paint rather than just put a bunch of dark paint on there and realize that it's way too dark. I'd much rather go in steps like this, and that way you avoid any catastrophes. So as you can see, it still wasn't enough, and I went in and added even more around the edge. Again, we did that in the first petal and just let that bleed through. And then we're going to go on to the last petal. Now that has purple all around that edge, so we have to really make sure that it's dry before you go in there and do that. Okay, I snuck in with my heat tool just to make sure that it really was dry. And now that I know it's good and dry, we'll go in and, oh, I noticed there was a little bit of a gap up in that upper petal, and I just quickly touched that up before I went in and did the last petal. But you can see, because that's got purple and it has a complete edge all the way around, that's why we needed to make sure it was completely dry. Other than that, I'm just following the same process, putting the purple around the edge, just softening it up with a damp brush, and then dragging those purple lines in. By the time I got these last two petals done, I realized that, or I just kind of felt that the first petal was a little paler and it was kind of lacking contrast to that yellow. So you'll see me go in and add just one last final hit of purple onto that first petal. And because it was already dry, what I did was I just added that other hit of purple and then went in with a damp brush and just kind of blended it out. Actually, I do it to the second petal as well. You'll see that coming up right here. Okay, so that's pretty dry as well. So again, I'm just softening it up, not bringing the lines down, just softening it so it kind of blends in with the rest of the petal. Okay, and then before we finish up, I'm going to take some black, add it to that green, and just go in and beef up some of these shadows just to make it pop a little more. On every leaf. And I'm not going to leave it like that. I'm going to go back in and soften those edges up. But when you're doing shadows like this, you don't want them too soft, because otherwise it just kind of loses the effect. Okay. So I'm not going to drag them out really far. I'm just going to slightly blur that edge. Just like that. I'm just going to kind of soften that up. Pick some of it up. Maybe not that much. This is what you call overworking your painting, where you've just overworked it and gone back and just did that one step too many. And then you want to kick yourself. But it's fixable, because what I'm going to do is dry off my brush and just kind of drag this all out. So maybe no one will know that I overworked my painting. Put another little vein in there and no one will be the wiser. Except that I have it on film here and you all saw me do it. So I think I'm going to call this done. There is your finished watercolor pansy. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and that you found it helpful. And as always, if you are on Instagram and you give this a try, please share and tag me so I can have a look. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. Take care, and I will see you next time.